right, welcome back everybody to another history episode here with Professor Sullivan. And today I've learned some exciting new news in the world of history that I wanted to share with all of you guys here today. Recently, actually earlier today, my wife, she actually was showing me a video on TikTok. I believe it was through National Geographic, but they've made a recent archaeological discovery at the Camden battlefield. And anyways, I got to thinking as she was showing me the TikTok video, I was answering a lot of questions that she was asking me, and I thought, well, hey, this would make a great kind of basis for a video. So today we're going to be talking about the Battle of Camden during the American Revolution, and also dive into the recent archaeological discovery that they just found on the battlefield. But anyways, with that said, just a little bit of background information before we go ahead and take a look at some of the recent news that came to light. The Battle of Camden, as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, it occurred during the American Revolutionary War, and it occurred a little bit later in the conflict. Now, what we had seen just kind of very briefly is the American Revolution, as we probably many of you know, began with the first shots at Lexington and Concord. And during the first half of the war, if you will, much of the fighting took place in the north, in places like Massachusetts, as well as New York, and even as far down south as Philadelphia. However, what we will see is by the latter portion of the war, especially after the French declare an alliance with the U.S. in February of 1778, we start to see that the war begins to shift away from the north. We'll see that the British forces would retreat out of Philadelphia after their occupation, retreat back to New York City, and from there, much of the northern British fighting forces would then be sent southward. And really, for the remainder of the war after 1779, we'll see much of the major fighting will occur within that theater of the conflict. But anyways, with that said, what we do start to see is British soldiers by the end of 1778, early 1779, begin to arrive and land near Savannah, Georgia, and from there we'll start to see that they begin to march northward, and along the way they're going to inflict a lot of major defeats on the American forces in the region. The most noteworthy of those would occur in May of 1780, when we'll see the British forces under the command of Major General Lord Charles Cornwallis attack and surround the city of Charleston, to where he'll surround an American army under Major General Benjamin Lincoln, and it would ultimately lead to the surrender of that American army, one of the most humiliating defeats of the conflict for the Americans. But anyways, with that said, after Cornwallis had successfully captured Charleston, he would then turn his attention northward to carve up much of the countryside within South Carolina. Now, at that point, the British strategy in the South was really they wanted to galvanize Southern support for the British cause, because they believed that the southern regions of the original 13 colonies were the most loyal. But anyways, with this said, we start to see that Lord Charles Cornwallis, by the summer of 1780, begins to march through especially the back country of South Carolina. And in the meantime, what we will see is the Continental Congress would send an American army down southward to confront Cornwallis and hopefully retake South Carolina. Now, that army would fall under the command of one Major General Horatio Gates, who was the victor of the Battle of Saratoga and a rival of George Washington. With this said, what we will see is by around July of 1780, he, as well as, if I'm remembering correctly, an army about 4,000 to 5,000 men strong, would then begin to march into South Carolina to meet up in a showdown with Lord Charles Cornwallis's soldiers. And eventually they would come to meet on a battlefield, or the battlefield of a place called Camden, which leads us to our topic for today. We'd see that the American army as well as the British army would confront each other on the morning of August 16th, 1780, just outside of Camden. With that said, what we start to see is both sides begin to deploy their troops. We'll see that the American forces under Gates would begin to deploy in traditional European-style tactics, basically marching on parade shoulder to shoulder. But anyways, with this said, we'll see the British soldiers likewise would confront them in a similar manner. However, what we will see is the day is going to quickly turn against the Americans and Horatio Gates, because we'll see that how Gates deploys his men. He'll put his veteran troops on the right portion of his line with his inexperienced troops on the left portion of the line. Why that's crucial is because we'll see that Cornwallis would deploy his men in a similar fashion. We'll see that his veteran troops on the right would attack the inexperienced Virginia militia that it was on Gates's left. Quickly, what we'll see is they would begin to retreat, especially after they see the British bayonets as they're charging their positions. And we'll see that the entire American army would then begin to collapse. We'll see that Gates would be forced to flee northward with the remnants of his army. And with it, we'll see that he would ultimately be relieved of his command as a result of this major defeat of American forces. Now, short story, what we will see is despite this major setback for American forces, they would come to win the revolution. However, with the Battle of Camden, it has gone down as one of the worst defeats suffered by American forces during the war. But anyways, with that said, with a little bit of context in regards to the Battle of Camden, let's go ahead and take a look at the recent archaeological finds that were made on that battlefield. All right, everybody. So I tried to take a look at a article from the recent archaeological digs that were made at Camden. However, I believe it was caught on copyright for the YouTube channel. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show an image of that. However, I will be showing this image of just the front of the battlefield. But anyways, just to kind of describe the archaeological finds that were recently discovered on Camden, is that archaeologists within the area began to dig a portion of the battlefield to begin to basically take up or try to see if they can find any sort of archaeological evidence that what I believed was in an old American camp. The reason for this is because they wanted to clear the site to make it free of really anything, so that way it could be opened up to tourism. But anyways, with that said, as they were going through this old American camp, they eventually found 14 bodies. Now, with that said, the 14 bodies were of soldiers from the Revolutionary period. One of them was a Native American, one of them was a British soldier who was buried relatively deep in the ground, and the other 12 were American soldiers who were buried fairly close together, almost as if they had been thrown on top of one another. Now, with that said, since they were buried pretty close to the surface as well as pretty much right on top of the other, my assumption is that this is probably a mass grave that was dug shortly after the battle to kind of get rid of the dead. However, with that said, this is a major find at the Camden battlefield, especially in the light of Veterans Day, which has recently passed upon recording this video, or the day after Veterans Day. And very much so, if you look at any of the articles that were coming out from various sources, as they would refer to these as some of America's first veterans. Now, with that said, my wife did ask me the question earlier about, well, why they were doing this archaeological dig, and then ultimately, what were they going to do with these bodies that they've now discovered? Well, the simple answer is what we will see is shortly after this is that the bodies that have been discovered, they would be taken to a scientific lab. From here, there'd be all sorts of studies that would be made onto the remains to try to see what happened to these individuals, who they were. We know a pretty good idea who these soldiers or what unit these soldiers would have fought for. They would have fought for the 2nd Maryland Brigade at the Battle of Camden. But they would look to see how did these individuals died, what did their lives look like, what were their diets, and so on and so forth. And then the next big question that my wife asked me as well is what happens to the remains now that they've exhumed them? Well, what they will do is after all of their evidence, upon further research, they will reinter the bodies. They will use 18th century caskets, from what I've read, or I should say 18th century wooden caskets to reinter them in the same spot that they were dug up. My guess would be afterwards they're going to mark the area as a mass grave of American soldiers, put the unit that they died, and so on and so forth to commemorate them moving forward. But anyways, this was a very huge find for the archaeological community, and it helps increase our understanding of the period as well. But anyways, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end this video. I hope everybody had enjoyed the content with this video, and with that said, hopefully in the future I'll make more videos related to the exciting news coming out of the historical world. But for now, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see you all next time.